6 years after paying her to erase his mistake, Daniel Robinson froze at the sight of Evelyn Morris walking through the glass-walled lobby of the Metropolitan Convention Center, her hands gently guiding three identical boys who carried his unmistakable green eyes and wild curls. The sleek 38th floor of Robinson Tech hummed with the rhythm of power, keyboards clicking, deals closing, and the faint aroma of premium espresso floating through climate-controlled air. Daniel Robinson, 37 and sculpted from ambition and Silicon Valley gold, stood behind his floor-to-ceiling windows, surveying the sprawling city below like a general assessing his conquered territory. His reflection stared back, sharp cheekbones, green eyes that could seduce venture capitalists or silence boardrooms, and the kind of confident smirk that had landed him on Forbes covers under headlines like "The Golden Prince of Tech, How Daniel Robinson Built a Billion-Dollar Empire Before 40. But today that smirk felt like a mask he could barely hold in place. "Mr. Robinson," his assistant's voice chimed through the intercom, crisp and efficient, "your keynote speech begins in 20 minutes. The car is waiting downstairs." Daniel adjusted his charcoal Tom Ford suit jacket, the same one he'd been wearing the day Evelyn had told him she was pregnant, the day he'd chosen his empire over everything else. He grabbed his phone, his leather briefcase, and headed toward the elevator, unaware that in exactly 17 minutes, his carefully constructed world would shatter into 3 perfect pieces. What would you do if you saw your past walking toward you? Drop your thoughts below. And if you're hooked already, smash that like button and subscribe, because this story is about to get real. You won't want to miss what happens when Daniel comes face to face with the 3 boys he never knew existed. 6 years after paying her to erase his mistake, Daniel Robinson froze at the sight of Evelyn Morris walking through the glass-walled lobby of the Metropolitan Convention Center, her hands gently guiding 3 identical boys who carried his unmistakable green eyes and wild curls. But let's rewind 12 hours. The sleek 38th floor of Robinson Tech hummed with the rhythm of power, keyboards clicking, deals closing, and the faint aroma of premium espresso floating through climate-controlled air. Daniel Robinson, 37 and sculpted from ambition and Silicon Valley gold, stood behind his floor-to-ceiling windows, surveying the sprawling city below like a general assessing his conquered territory. His reflection stared back, sharp cheekbones, green eyes that could seduce venture capitalists or silence boardrooms, and the kind of confident smirk that had landed him on Forbes covers under headlines like "The Golden Prince of Tech, How Daniel Robinson Built a Billion-Dollar Empire Before 40. But today that smirk felt like a mask he could barely hold in place. "Mr. Robinson," his assistant's voice chimed through the intercom, crisp and efficient, "the board is ready in conference room A." Daniel turned from the window, straightening his charcoal Tom Ford suit jacket. His office was a study in controlled perfection, minimalist furniture, abstract art worth more than most people's homes, and not a single personal photograph in sight. Nothing messy, nothing human, nothing that could be used against him. Exactly how he needed it. The board meeting lasted 2 hours. Quarterly reports, expansion strategies, a potential merger with a European tech firm that would catapult Robinson Tech into the global stratosphere. Daniel navigated it all with surgical precision, his voice steady, his arguments airtight, his smile calculated to inspire confidence without revealing warmth. "Brilliant work, Daniel," Chairman Morrison said as they filed out. "You never miss a beat." Daniel nodded, accepting the praise with practiced humility. But inside something cold settled in his chest. You never miss a beat. Except for the one time he had, 6 years ago, when fear had made him choose an envelope full of cash over something, someone, far more valuable. He shook the thought away as he returned to his office, already checking his phone for the afternoon's agenda. Leadership summit, keynote speech, networking reception. The kind of events where Daniel Robinson shined, where his reputation preceded him like expensive cologne. "Your car is waiting downstairs, Mr. Robinson," his assistant reminded him at 1:45 p.m. Daniel grabbed his leather briefcase and headed toward the elevator, his mind already rehearsing talking points, strategizing which investors to approach, calculating every move. Control, always control. The Metropolitan Convention Center gleamed under the afternoon sun, all polished glass and modern architecture. Daniel stepped out of his black Mercedes, nodded to his driver, and strode toward the entrance with the confidence of a man who owned every room he entered. Inside, the atrium buzzed with the energy of ambitious professionals. Tailored suits, designer dresses, champagne glasses catching the light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Marble floors reflected the movement of hundreds of attendees, their voices creating a sophisticated hum beneath the soft classical music. Daniel checked his watch, 15 minutes before his keynote. Plenty of time. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails as he walked, his practiced smile ready for the handshakes and small talk that would inevitably... Laughter. Children's laughter. Daniel's thumb paused mid-scroll. The sound was out of place here, bright and unfiltered in a space designed for corporate polish. He glanced up, and that's when he saw them. 3 small boys, identical in every way, ran slightly ahead through the lobby. Their tiny suspenders bounced with each step. Tight curls, deep brown with hints of gold where the sunlight caught them, glowed like miniature halos. One boy turned his head, distracted by the fountain in the center of the atrium. Green eyes, unmistakable green eyes. Daniel's chest tightened. Then the second boy looked back, laughing at something his brother said. The same eyes, the same angle of the jaw, the same... No. The third boy stopped completely, tugging on someone's hand, pointing at a banner advertising the leadership summit. Daniel's throat went dry. All 3 faces, all 3 perfect mirrors of photographs he'd seen in his mother's albums, photographs of himself at age 5 or 6, before the world had taught him to hide behind walls of ambition and control. His phone slipped slightly in his hand. "Boys, stay close," a voice called, warm, familiar, like a song he'd tried to forget. Daniel's gaze traveled up from the children to the woman guiding them. She wore a fitted yellow dress that caught the light beautifully, elegant but unpretentious. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun, a few strands escaping to frame her face. She looked fuller than he remembered, stronger, more confident, radiant in a way that had nothing to do with makeup or designer labels. Evelyn Morris. His breath caught in his throat. She was smiling down at the boys, adjusting one's collar with practiced maternal care, saying something that made them giggle. Her entire being glowed with a contentment Daniel had never seen in her before. The contentment of a mother. As if sensing his stare, Evelyn lifted her head. Her eyes, those same warm brown eyes that had once looked at him with trust, with hope, with love, locked onto his. Daniel stood frozen 15 feet away from the bench, where 3 little boys sat swinging their legs, whispering to each other with the conspiratorial energy of siblings. The serious one, dark curls perfectly combed, sat upright, watching Daniel with careful assessment. The curious one in the middle kept adjusting his glasses, tilting his head like he was solving a puzzle. The playful one on the end grinned at something, his dimple flashing exactly where Daniel's did. They were beautiful, perfect, real, and they were his. The weight of that realization crushed the air from Daniel's lungs. For 6 years he'd told himself Evelyn had followed through, that the envelope had served its purpose, that the problem had been solved, allowing him to continue building his empire uninterrupted. But here was the truth, living and breathing and laughing on a marble bench. She'd kept them. All of them. Triplets, Daniel's mind whispered in awe and horror. 3 sons. The serious boy, maybe a minute older than his brothers, leaned over and whispered something. All 3 pairs of green eyes turned toward Daniel, studying him with unnerving intensity. "Mama," the playful one called out. "Why is that man staring at us?" Evelyn, who had been standing like a statue several feet away, finally moved. She walked to her sons with deliberate steps, her yellow dress swaying, her face a mask of protective determination. "Boys," she said softly, kneeling between them, "Mama needs you to stay right here for just a minute, okay? But Mama..." "Please, Kevin, just 1 minute." The playful boy, Kevin, nodded reluctantly. Evelyn stood, turned, and walked directly toward Daniel. Every step she took felt like judgment. When she stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, close enough to smell the faint scent of vanilla that he still sometimes remembered in dreams, she spoke. Her voice was steady, strong, unbreakable. "You don't get to pretend they don't exist anymore. You don't get to pretend they don't exist anymore." Evelyn's words hung in the air between them like a verdict. Daniel's mouth opened, but no sound came out. What could he possibly say? "I'm sorry" felt pathetic. "I didn't know" was a lie they both understood. "I was wrong" didn't even scratch the surface of his failure. "Evelyn, Don't." She held up one hand, her voice low enough that the boys couldn't hear, but sharp enough to cut. "Don't you dare apologize. Don't you dare act surprised. You paid me to make them disappear, and when I didn't, you never once looked back to check." "I thought you—" Daniel's voice faltered. "I thought you went through with it." Evelyn's laugh was bitter, broken. "Of course you did, because thinking anything else would have required you to care." The words hit like physical blows. "How—" Daniel glanced at the boys, his throat tight. "How did you—" The smile vanished from her face. Color drained from her cheeks. Her grip on the boys' hands visibly tightened. For 3 heartbeats they simply stared at each other across the marble expanse. The noise of the convention center faded into white static. The world narrowed to just this moment, this impossible collision of past and present. Daniel's mind raced, memory fragments crashing through his carefully constructed walls. The envelope sliding across his desk. Evelyn's tears trembling in her eyes. "I can't let this destroy everything I've built." Her whispered response, "They're not everything, they're someone." The empty desk the next morning. 6 years of silence. But now she wasn't silent. She was here, real, solid. And beside her stood 3 living, breathing pieces of evidence that she'd made a different choice than the one he'd paid her to make. Evelyn's eyes flickered down to the boys, then back to Daniel. Her jaw set with determination, her posture shifting subtly into something protective, defensive. She bent down slightly, whispering something to the children. They nodded obediently, moving to stand beside a nearby bench, their innocent faces curious about the sudden tension in their mother's voice. Daniel's legs moved before his brain could stop them. He took 1 step forward. Evelyn's eyes widened, her hand coming up slightly as if to ward him off. But Daniel couldn't stop. 6 years of buried guilt, of midnight thoughts he'd drowned in work, of moments when he'd wondered what if. All of it surged forward with crushing weight. The boys on the bench turned to look at him, 3 sets of green eyes studying the tall stranger approaching their mother. His green eyes, his curls, his face. "It can't be," Daniel whispered, the words escaping like a prayer or a curse. Evelyn took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching toward her son's. But Daniel kept walking, because running was no longer an option. Not anymore, 6 years ago. Evelyn Morris had never imagined that staying late at the office would change her entire life. But that's exactly what happened the first night Daniel Robinson looked at her, like she was more than just his assistant. It was nearly 10 p.m. The Robinson Tech headquarters had emptied hours ago, leaving only the hum of computers and the distant whoosh of the cleaning crew's vacuums. Evelyn sat across from Daniel's desk, her blazer draped over her chair, reading through merger documents while he paced, thinking out loud. "The European market is tricky," he said, running his hand through his hair. A rare gesture of uncertainty that made him seem almost human. "Morrison wants aggressive expansion, but I think we need to be strategic." "Strategic doesn't mean slow," Evelyn offered, looking up from the contracts. "It means smart." Daniel stopped pacing. He looked at her, really looked at her, and smiled. Not his practiced CEO smile, but something genuine. "That's exactly what I needed to hear." Something shifted in the air between them. It started innocently enough. Late nights turned into shared takeout dinners at his desk. Business conversations evolved into personal stories. Daniel told her about the pressure of living up to his father's legacy, the loneliness of being untouchable. Evelyn shared her dreams of eventually going back to school, her close relationship with her mother, her love of old movies. "You're brilliant," he told her one night, leaning back in his chair, his tie loosened, his walls finally down. "You know that, right? You could run your own company." Evelyn laughed, surprised by the compliment. "I'm happy where I am." "Are you?" Daniel's green eyes held hers. "Happy?" The question felt loaded with something neither of them was ready to name. 3 weeks later, they crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. It happened after a particularly grueling board meeting. Daniel had defended a risky investment, and Evelyn had stayed late to help him prepare the follow-up reports. The tension, the adrenaline, the proximity, It all combusted into a kiss that tasted like expensive whiskey and terrible decisions. "We shouldn't," Evelyn whispered against his lips. "I know," Daniel breathed back. But they did anyway. For 2 months they existed in a secret world. Stolen moments in his office, weekend trips disguised as business conferences, morning coffee that felt like domesticity, neither of them acknowledged. Evelyn knew it was temporary. Men like Daniel Robinson didn't end up with their assistants. But in those quiet moments when he held her, when he laughed at her jokes, when he looked at her like she was the only person in the world who mattered, she let herself believe. Until the morning she saw 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test. Evelyn stood outside Daniel's office, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. Inside was the test wrapped in tissue paper like a fragile secret. She'd rehearsed this conversation 100 times, imagined his reaction, hoped for understanding, support, maybe even joy. She knocked. "Come in." Daniel sat behind his desk, reviewing quarterly reports, his reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked up and smiled, the warm smile he reserved only for her. "Hey you, what's up?" Evelyn's courage nearly failed her, but she stepped forward, closing the door behind her. "We need to talk." Something in her tone made Daniel set down his papers. His expression shifted to concern. "Is everything okay?" "I'm pregnant." 2 words, simple, devastating. The silence that followed felt like falling. Daniel's face went through a series of micro-expressions: shock, disbelief, panic, and finally something cold and calculating that Evelyn had only seen him use in hostile negotiations. "Are you sure?" His voice had lost all warmth. "I took 3 tests, yes, I'm sure." Daniel stood, turned toward his window, his back to her. His shoulders tensed beneath his expensive suit jacket. When he spoke again, his tone was measured, clinical. "We need to think about this strategically." Strategically. The word hit Evelyn like a slap. "Daniel, the board is already watching me closely because of the European expansion. I'm about to close the biggest deal of my career." He turned to face her, and his eyes were different, distant, guarded. "I can't have a scandal right now. The press would destroy me, destroy us." "Scandal?" Evelyn's voice cracked. "This is a baby, our baby." "That's a complication," Daniel corrected, his jaw tight. "One we need to handle carefully." He walked to his desk, pulled out his checkbook, and began writing. The sound of pen scratching paper filled the terrible silence. When he finished, he slid an envelope across the polished mahogany surface. Evelyn stared at it like it was a snake. "What is that?" "Enough money to take care of everything," Daniel said quietly. "The procedure, recovery time, and enough extra for you to take a few weeks off, maybe travel, clear your head." The room spun. "You want me to have an abortion? I want us to make the smart choice." His voice softened, but his eyes remained hard. "Evelyn, you're young. You have your whole life ahead of you. We both do. A child right now would derail everything, your future, my company, all of it." "I don't care about the company." "Well, I do." Daniel's composure cracked for just a moment. "I've spent my entire life building this. I can't let one mistake destroy everything." Evelyn felt tears burning behind her eyes. "Mistake, that's what you think this is?" Daniel's expression softened slightly, regret flickering across his features. "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did." Evelyn picked up the envelope with shaking hands. It felt obscenely heavy. "You meant every word." She looked at the man she'd fallen in love with, the man who had held her, whispered promises, made her believe she mattered, and saw only a stranger in an expensive suit. "They're not everything, Daniel," she whispered, her hand instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. "There's someone." Daniel's jaw clenched. "I can't let this destroy everything I've built." Evelyn nodded slowly, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "Then I guess you've made your choice." She turned toward the door. "Evelyn, wait." "Goodbye, Daniel." She didn't look back. The next morning her desk was empty. Her resignation letter sat in Daniel's inbox, and Evelyn Morris vanished from his life as completely as if she'd never existed. Daniel told himself it was for the best. He told himself he'd made the right choice. He told himself he'd forget. But late at night, in his empty penthouse, he'd stare at the ceiling and wonder what he'd really lost. You want to know how a pregnant woman with no job, no references, and no support survived? Is that what you're asking? Daniel nodded, shame burning through his chest. Evelyn's eyes glistened, but she didn't let the tears fall. I went home, back to my mother in our tiny 2-bedroom apartment in Queens, the same apartment I swore I'd escape by working for you. She looked past him, her gaze distant, remembering. Mama didn't ask questions when I showed up with my suitcase and your blood money. She just held me while I cried for 3 days straight. Evelyn's voice wavered. When I finally told her I was pregnant, you know what she did? She sold her wedding ring, the only thing she had left of my father. Daniel's stomach twisted. She sold it to buy me prenatal vitamins and maternity clothes. She worked double shifts at the diner so I could rest. She rubbed my feet when they swelled. She held my hair back when the morning sickness lasted all day and all night. Evelyn, at my first ultrasound they told me there were 3 heartbeats. Evelyn's voice broke slightly. 3 babies. The doctor said it was high risk, that I needed to be careful, that carrying triplets to term would be... She paused, steadying herself. Difficult. Daniel's hands clenched at his sides. You were alone. Yes? The single word carried 6 years of pain. I was terrified. I worked 2 jobs until I was 7 months pregnant. Data entry in the morning, retail in the evening. I slept on the floor so the boys could have cribs when they came. She looked directly at him now, her brown eyes blazing. I went into labor at 34 weeks. Alone in the apartment, Mama was at work. I called 911 and rode in the ambulance by myself, praying they'd all make it. Daniel felt something crack inside his chest. They were so small, Evelyn whispered, her hand unconsciously moving to her heart. Matthew came first, 5 pounds, 2 ounces. Then Gerald, 4 pounds, 11 ounces. Kevin was last, 4 pounds, 8 ounces. They were early, underweight, but perfect. She smiled through tears that finally fell. I named Matthew after my father, Gerald after my grandfather, Kevin after Mama's brother who died young. They were my family's legacy, my hope made flesh. Her voice hardened. They were never yours to erase. Daniel couldn't breathe. 6 years ago he'd seen only numbers on a page, costs, risks, complications. He'd never imagined this, never let himself see the reality of what he'd tried to destroy. 3 miracles, 3 sons. His voice cracked. God, Evelyn, I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't raise children, she shot back. Sorry doesn't pay for formula or diapers or clothes they outgrow every 3 months. Sorry doesn't sing lullabies at 2 a.m. when they're all crying at once. You're right. Daniel swallowed hard. You're absolutely right. Movement caught his attention. The boys had stood up from the bench, clearly tired of waiting. The serious one, Matthew, walked toward them first, his small hand reaching for Evelyn's. Mama, are you okay? His voice was mature beyond his years, protective. Evelyn immediately shifted, her face softening as she knelt down. I'm fine, baby. Mama's just talking to an old friend. He doesn't look like a friend, Matthew observed, his green eyes, Daniel's eyes, assessing him with unnerving intelligence. You look sad when you talk to him. The other 2 boys joined them. Gerald, the one with glasses, studied Daniel with scientific curiosity. Kevin, the playful one with the dimple, simply stared with open confusion. Who is he, Mama? Kevin asked. Evelyn looked up at Daniel, a question in her eyes. Are you ready for this? Daniel knelt slowly, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. Up close, the resemblance was staggering. Each face was a variation of his own childhood photographs. The same bone structure, the same expressions, the same presence. Hi, he said softly, his voice unsteady. My name is Daniel. Like Daniel from the Lion's Den? Kevin's face lit up. We learned about him in Sunday school. Despite everything, Daniel almost smiled. Something like that. Matthew stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of his brothers. Why were you staring at us? Matthew, Evelyn warned gently. It's okay, Daniel said. He looked at Matthew, this serious, brave little boy who'd become the protector his father should have been. I was staring because you remind me of someone. Who? Gerald adjusted his glasses, genuinely curious. Daniel's throat tightened. Me when I was your age. The 3 boys exchanged glances. a silent conversation happening between them that only siblings could understand. Kevin tilted his head. "You look like us." "Yeah," Gerald agreed, pushing his glasses up. "You have our eyes and our hair, and your chin does the dimple thing like Kevin's." Matthew's expression shifted from protective to analytical. He studied Daniel's face with uncomfortable intensity, then looked at his brothers, then back at Daniel. "Are you—" Matthew's voice was careful, measured. "Are you our uncle?" "Matthew," Evelyn started. "Or are you our daddy?" The question came out quiet but devastating. The lobby seemed to stop. Other convention attendees walked past, oblivious to the world-changing moment happening on the marble floor. Daniel's eyes burned. He looked at Evelyn, silently asking permission. She gave the smallest nod. "Yes," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm your father." Kevin's eyes went wide. Gerald's mouth opened in surprise, but Matthew's expression hardened, his small jaw setting in a way that looked heartbreakingly familiar. "Then where were you?" Matthew demanded, his voice rising. "Where were you when Mama was sick? Where were you when we were born? Where were you for our birthdays and our first day of school, and when Kevin broke his arm, and when Gerald learned to read?" Each question was an arrow, precise and painful. "Matthew, that's enough." Evelyn tried to intervene. "No, Mama. He said he's our daddy, but daddies don't disappear." Tears filled Matthew's eyes, but he blinked them back furiously. "Daddies stay." Daniel felt tears sliding down his own face. "You're right, I should have been there. I should have been there for all of it." "Why weren't you?" Kevin asked, his voice small and hurt. "Because I was scared," Daniel admitted. "Because I was selfish, because I thought my job and my money and my reputation mattered more than—" He looked at each boy, then at Evelyn. "More than the greatest gift I could ever have." Gerald spoke up, his analytical mind working through the problem. "But you're here now." "Yes." "Are you going to leave again?" Kevin's lip trembled. Daniel shook his head firmly. "Never." "How do we know?" Matthew challenged, his arms crossing. "How do we know you won't get scared again?" The question was so mature, so devastatingly perceptive, that Daniel felt his heart shatter completely. He looked at this 6-year-old boy, this child he'd never met, never held, never sung to sleep, and saw courage that put his own to shame. "You don't know," Daniel answered honestly. "I can't prove it with words. I can only prove it by staying, by showing up, by being the father I should have been from the beginning." Matthew stared at him for a long moment. Then he asked the question that would change everything. "Are you brave enough to stay this time?" The words echoed through Daniel's soul. 6 years ago, he'd been too afraid to choose love over image, too weak to choose family over fortune, too broken to see what truly mattered. But looking at these 3 boys, Matthew's fierce protection, Gerald's cautious hope, Kevin's desperate need, Daniel finally understood what courage really meant. It wasn't closing deals or building empires. It was this: being vulnerable, being accountable, being present. Daniel knelt fully on the marble floor, not caring who saw him, not caring about his expensive suit or his reputation, or the investors watching from across the lobby. He looked at his sons, all 3 of them, and then at Evelyn. "I want to be your father," he said clearly, his voice steady despite his tears. "If you'll let me. I want to be your father, if you'll let me. I want to be your father, if you'll let me." The words hung in the air of the convention center lobby, witnessed by strangers who had no idea they were watching a man's entire world reconstruct itself on a marble floor. Matthew's expression didn't soften. "We'll see." Gerald nodded slowly, still processing. Kevin just stared, his small hand gripping Evelyn's tighter. Evelyn's voice was quiet but firm. "Boys, go sit on the bench. I need to talk to Mr. Robinson alone." The triplets obeyed, but Matthew kept glancing back, his protective instincts on high alert. Once they were out of earshot, Evelyn turned to Daniel, her arms crossed. "Don't make promises you can't keep. They've lived 6 years without a father. They'll survive if you disappear again. But if you make them hope and then break their hearts—" "I won't," Daniel interrupted. "You already did, to me." Her voice cracked. "I loved you, Daniel. I trusted you, and you handed me an envelope like I was a problem to be solved." The accusation landed like it should, with devastating accuracy. "I know." Daniel stood, facing her fully. "And I can't undo that, but I can choose differently now. I can be the man I should have been then." "Words are easy. Then let me prove it with actions." Daniel's voice was steady, resolute. "Let me be in their lives. Let me learn how to be their father." Evelyn studied him for a long moment, her brown eyes searching for sincerity, for strength, for some sign that he wouldn't run when things got difficult. Finally she spoke. "You want to be their father? Then you tell them the truth, all of it. You tell them why you weren't there. You own what you did." Daniel's stomach clenched. "Evelyn!" "No," she shook her head. "You don't get to rewrite history. You don't get to be the hero who just showed up late. If you want them to trust you, you start with honesty. It would destroy him, his image, his reputation, everything." But looking at those 3 boys on the bench, his sons, Daniel realized he'd been destroying himself all along by hiding. "Okay," he agreed, "I'll tell them." 2 days later, the press conference was Daniel's idea. His PR team had begged him to reconsider. His lawyers had strongly advised against it. Chairman Morrison had explicitly forbidden it. But Daniel Robinson stood behind the podium in the Robinson Tech media room anyway, facing a sea of reporters whose cameras flashed like hungry predators. "Thank you all for coming," Daniel began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I've called this conference to address a personal matter that I've kept hidden for too long." The room buzzed with anticipation. Reporters leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. 6 years ago, I had a relationship with a woman who worked for me. When she told me she was pregnant, I responded with cowardice instead of courage. Daniel's hands gripped the podium. I offered her money to have an abortion and to disappear from my life. I chose my reputation over responsibility. I chose my career over what was right. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras clicked furiously. That woman kept her pregnancy. She gave birth to triplet boys, my sons, and raised them alone while I built my empire and pretended the situation had been resolved. His voice cracked. I was wrong. I was selfish. And I abandoned 3 children who deserved a father. A reporter shouted, "Mr. Robinson, are you facing a lawsuit?" "No, this isn't about legal pressure. This is about moral accountability." Daniel looked directly into the cameras. "I'm here to publicly acknowledge my sons, Matthew, Gerald, and Kevin, and to commit to being the father they deserve, even though I failed them at the beginning." Another reporter, "What about Robinson Tech? Will this affect your position?" "If the board decides my leadership is compromised by my personal failures, I'll accept their decision. But my priority now is my family, not my stock price." The room erupted in questions, but Daniel simply said, "Thank you," and walked off the stage. His phone exploded with calls before he even reached the parking lot. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Business Insider, tech billionaire admits to abandoning triplets. Forbes, Daniel Robinson's empire shaken by pregnancy scandal. Twitter trended Jada Robinson scandal for 3 days straight. Morrison called an emergency board meeting. Investors pulled out of meetings. Partners reconsidered contracts. But the worst call came from his mother. "Daniel Christopher Robinson, what have you done?" Her voice was ice. "I told the truth, Mom. You destroyed everything your father built. Everything we built." She was furious, panicked. "The board is calling for your resignation. Your reputation is in shambles. And for what? Some woman and her—" "My sons," Daniel interrupted coldly. "Your grandsons." Silence. "You have grandchildren, and your first concern is the company." "Don't you dare lecture me about priorities," she snapped. "You're the one who hid this for 6 years. And I'm done hiding." Daniel's voice was firm. "I'm choosing them, Mom, with or without your support." She hung up. Daniel stood alone in his penthouse, the skyline glittering outside his windows, and felt the walls of his perfect life crumbling around him. But strangely, he didn't feel afraid. He felt free. The next Saturday, Daniel showed up at the address Evelyn had reluctantly provided, a modest apartment building in Queens, worn but clean. He knocked, his hands full of wrapped gifts that suddenly felt ridiculous. Evelyn answered, surprised. "You're early. I didn't want to be late." She stepped aside, letting him in. The apartment was small, maybe a third the size of his penthouse, but it was filled with life. Crayon drawings on the refrigerator, toys in organized bins, photos covering every surface. 3 pairs of small sneakers lined up by the door. "Boys," Evelyn called, "your Daniel is here." 3 heads poked around the corner. Matthew's expression was guarded. Gerald looked curious. Kevin brightened slightly. "Hi," Daniel said awkwardly, holding up the gifts. I wasn't sure what you like, so We don't need presents," Matthew said flatly. Daniel lowered the bags. "Okay, then what do you need?" The question seemed to surprise them. Gerald spoke up. "Mama's sink is broken. It drips all night." Daniel blinked. "I can fix that." "Do you know how to fix sinks?" Kevin sounded skeptical. "I can learn." For the next 2 hours, Daniel Robinson, Billionaire CEO, tech genius magazine cover model, sat on the floor of a tiny apartment bathroom with a YouTube tutorial playing on his phone, trying to fix a leaky faucet while 3 6-year-old boys watched critically. "You're doing it wrong," Matthew observed. "That wrench is too big," Gerald added. "You look funny upside down," Kevin giggled. Daniel bumped his head on the pipe, cursed under his breath, then caught himself. Darn it." Kevin laughed harder. By the time Daniel finished, soaking wet from an accidental pipe burst, the sink still dripped. "I'll call a plumber," he admitted, defeated. But Matthew's expression had softened, just slightly. "You tried," the boy said. "That's something." Over the next 3 months, Daniel tried. A lot. He showed up for Saturday visits. He learned their routines. He attempted to cook dinner and burned pasta, something Evelyn didn't think was physically possible. He attended Kevin's school play, sitting in a tiny chair meant for parents half his size, and cheered louder than anyone when his son played tree number 3. He helped Gerald build a science project about volcanoes that exploded all over Daniel's designer suit. He sat with Matthew while the boy did homework, learning that his oldest son was brilliant but struggled with reading comprehension, something Daniel quietly hired a tutor to help with. But he also made mistakes. He missed a soccer game because of a board meeting and saw the disappointment in Kevin's eyes. He bought them expensive toys they didn't want, instead of spending time they desperately needed. 6 months later, the alarm clock in Daniel Robinson's bedroom went off at 6:30 a.m., but he was already awake. Not because of anxiety or board meetings or quarterly reports. Those were someone else's problems now. He was awake because Kevin had crawled into his bed at 5 a.m., claiming there was a monster in the closet, and Gerald had followed 10 minutes later with a book about space that he absolutely needed to discuss right now. Matthew, ever the independent one, had stayed in his own bed. Probably. Daniel carefully extracted himself from the tangle of small limbs, tucked the boys back under the covers, and padded barefoot into the kitchen of the home he never expected to have. Not his penthouse, not anymore. 6 months ago he'd sold it and bought a house in a quiet neighborhood near Evelyn's apartment. 4 bedrooms, a backyard, good school district, the kind of place that came with swing sets instead of skyline views. The kitchen was chaos in the best way. 3 lunch boxes lined up on the counter, each labeled with a name in Evelyn's handwriting. A reminder note stuck to the fridge. Matthew, library book due Friday. Gerald, science fair tomorrow. Kevin, show and tell. Daniel smiled as he started the coffee maker. This was his empire now. The real Evelyn emerged from her bedroom, technically still separate from his, though the boundaries had been shifting slowly, carefully over the past months. She wore an oversized sweater and pajama pants, her hair in a messy bun, no makeup. She'd never looked more beautiful. "You're up early," she said, reaching for a mug. The boys had nightmares and space questions. Evelyn laughed softly, the sound warm and familiar. "Sounds about right." They moved around each other in the kitchen with practiced ease, a dance they'd learned through repetition. Daniel making eggs, Evelyn packing lunches, both of them stepping aside at exactly the right moments to avoid collision. "Your mother called yesterday," Evelyn said carefully, pouring orange juice into 3 plastic cups. Daniel's hand paused over the frying pan. "What did she want?" "To apologize, again." Evelyn glanced at him, and to ask if she could come to Kevin's birthday party next week. Daniel had barely spoken to his mother since his public confession. She'd initially been furious, ashamed, worried about the family name. But something had shifted 3 months ago when she'd finally agreed to meet the boys. "I'm not saying it's easy," she cautioned. "I'm not saying the past doesn't hurt, but I'm saying I think I'm ready to try. Really try, if you are." Daniel reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Evelyn Morris, I have been trying to earn my way back to you from the moment I saw you in that convention center. and I will keep trying every single day for the rest of my life if you'll let me. Even when I'm difficult? Especially then. Even when the boys are impossible? They're perfect, so that won't be an issue, Daniel teased. Right on cue, Kevin shrieked as Gerald accidentally hit him with a soccer ball, and Matthew started refereeing with the authority of a Supreme Court justice. Evelyn laughed. Still think they're perfect? Absolutely. Daniel pulled her closer. Every chaotic, loud, messy, beautiful moment. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat together watching their sons play as twilight settled over the yard. I hated you, Evelyn whispered. For so long I hated you. I know. But love didn't die, she said, echoing words she'd once told him. It just waited. Daniel kissed the top of her head. I lost 6 years with them. 6 years I can never get back. No, she agreed, you can't. But I'm going to make every single day from now count. He watched Matthew help Kevin up from where he'd fallen, Gerald already explaining the physics of soccer ball trajectory. I'm going to be the father they deserve, the partner you deserve. You already are, Evelyn said softly. Inside the house, Daniel's phone buzzed with notifications he'd stopped checking obsessively months ago. Business news, stock updates, company alerts about Robinson Tech's new CEO. He ignored all of it, because Kevin was calling, "Dad, Dad, watch this," and performing an elaborate cartwheel that ended in a collapse of giggles. Because Gerald was running over with a leaf, explaining its scientific name with breathless excitement. Because Matthew was looking at him with trust instead of suspicion, asking, "Can we have a campfire tonight?" This was his legacy now, not buildings or boardrooms or billion-dollar valuations. 3 boys who called him Dad, 1 woman who was learning to love him again. A home filled with chaos and laughter, and sticky handprints on the walls. Later that night, after the campfire had been built and s'mores had been consumed, and 3 exhausted boys had been tucked into bed, Daniel stood in the doorway of their shared room. Kevin sprawled across his bed like a starfish. Gerald clutched a book even in sleep. Matthew had somehow ended up with his feet on his pillow. Daniel's sons, his miracles, his second chance. Evelyn appeared beside him, slipping her hand into his. "What are you thinking?" she whispered. Daniel smiled, tears pricking his eyes. 6 years ago, I thought building an empire made me successful, he said quietly. I thought money and power and magazine covers meant I'd made it. And now? Now I know the truth. He looked at her, then back at his sleeping sons. I didn't lose my empire when I chose love. He pulled Evelyn close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I finally found my soul. Sometimes the stories we tell aren't just about the characters on the page. They're about us. The choices we make when no one's watching, the fears we let control us, and the courage it takes to choose love when pride feels safer. Daniel Robinson's story teaches us something profound. Money cannot erase consequences. That envelope didn't solve his problem. It created 6 years of regret, 3 sons who grew up without him, and a woman who learned to survive his absence. Pride destroys what love could save. How many of us have chosen our image over our hearts, our careers over our connections, our fear of judgment over the risk of vulnerability? Silence is sometimes the greatest betrayal. Daniel's silence didn't protect anyone. It abandoned everyone. But here's the hope in this story. Forgiveness is not forgetting, it is choosing peace. Evelyn didn't erase the past, she chose to build a future anyway. Children are never mistakes. Matthew, Gerald, and Kevin were never problems to be solved. They were miracles waiting to be seen. And finally, love delayed is not love lost. It just waits for us to be brave enough to claim it. What choice are you delaying today? If this story made you think, made you feel, or made you believe in second chances, subscribe for more stories that matter. Because everyone deserves a reminder that it's never too late to choose love. Hit that notification bell. Your next favorite story is coming soon.